The year is 1897. The place, a cold, wind-battered manor house nestled deep in the unforgiving moorlands of North Yorkshire. But this is not a story of ghosts haunting an ancestral hall. This is the chilling account of a haunting far more corporeal, far more destructive. The haunting of a family by its own matriarch, a woman whose terrifying ambition and twisted practices forged a monster out of her own flesh and blood. Picture, if you will, the scene as it unfolded on a night colder than a grave. Two men, brothers, their faces pale and slick with sweat, stood locked in a silent, savage tableau. Their names were William and Arthur, their shared history a tapestry woven with obsession, fear, and a macabre devotion to the woman who controlled their every breath. She, of course, was Alara Thorne. Alara did not raise sons, she conducted an experiment. Her maternal instinct was not one of warmth, but of an icy, calculating design, a forbidden alchemy aimed at perfecting a lineage she deemed flawed. She had discovered, or perhaps created, a chilling set of beliefs, a banned philosophy she called the purge of the softness. This creed dictated that all emotion, all human fragility must be systematically excised from the male psyche. She was determined to create a new breed of man, utterly brilliant, utterly ruthless, and utterly devoid of conscience. This night in 1897, the experiment had reached its terrifying, blood-soaked climax. One brother held a blade, the other, a look of profound, horrifying defeat. And somewhere within the manor's granite walls, Alara Thorne was listening, a slow, predatory smile chilling her lips. The silence was broken only by the moor wind, and a sound that would forever stain the legacy of the Thorne family, the sickening, wet thud of something heavy falling to the floor. What happened next was immediately concealed, swallowed by the manor's isolation and Alara's pervasive, cold case efficiency. But the disturbing practices that led to this awful moment, the psychological torture, the chemical interventions, the calculated destruction of innocence, those secrets are what we must now unearth. To understand the horrifying end, we must return to the disturbing genesis of Alara Thorne's ideology. Alara was not born into darkness, she was cultivated by it. Her own father, a disgraced academic fascinated by eugenics and esoteric, forgotten medical texts, had instilled in her a profound contempt for what he called the mediocrity of the masses. Upon inheriting his vast, yet morally compromised, library and considerable fortune, Alara vowed to transcend the human condition. She married a man, Elias Thorne, not for love, but for his malleable intellect and his equally obscure, if less alarming, interest in psychological conditioning. Elias was a footnote in her grand, macabre plan, a necessary variable for the generation of her perfect specimens. He would vanish from the narrative far sooner than anticipated, swallowed by the realization of his wife's escalating madness. The birth of William, the elder son, was the beginning of the twisted project. Even as an infant, William was subjected to a regimen that was more research protocol than parenting. Alara would conduct chilling sensory deprivation experiments on him, leaving the child in utter darkness for hours, recording his developing tolerances to fear and isolation. She believed that by systematically denying him comfort, she was strengthening his will, or more accurately, calcifying his soul. The manor house, with its sprawling, cold corridors and isolated wings, became a laboratory dedicated to the horrifying pursuit of her perfection. The local villagers, a superstitious and insular lot, began to whisper. They saw the closed carriages, the drawn curtains, the complete absence of children playing, and assigned the house a curse. They spoke of the forbidden rituals conducted within, the strange, acrid smells that sometimes drifted across the moor. This was the first layer of dread that encased the Thorne family, a prelude to the true, macabre story. It was only after the arrival of Arthur, 5 years later, that Alara's practices took on an even more creepy dimension. She now had a control group, a contrast, a means of creating a deadly, sibling rivalry essential to her final goal, pitting her creations against one another in a bid for ultimate supremacy. Arthur's upbringing was designed to mirror William, yet with a crucial, calculated difference. Where William was conditioned through isolation and subtle emotional cruelty, Arthur was conditioned through engineered dependence and then, sudden, cruel abandonment. Alara meticulously manipulated the bonds between the brothers, ensuring that every moment of affection was swiftly followed by a punitive separation, creating a constant, low-level anxiety that she could exploit. This was her psychological alchemy, a slow-burn process of introducing and withdrawing affection to establish herself as the sole arbiter of their emotional landscape. They learned quickly that pleasing their mother was the only path to a momentary reprieve from the pervasive dread. But pleasing her was an ever-moving target, set by criteria that were increasingly macabre and non-human. At the age of 10, William was required to dissect live animals, not for any anatomical study, but to desensitize him to the sight of suffering. Alara would observe him, making copious notes in a leather-bound journal that would later become a crucial piece of the cold case. She was looking for a flicker of empathy, a tremor of revulsion. When she found none, she marked it as a success. This journal, filled with her clinical observations and philosophical justifications for her actions, provides the most disturbing insight into the mind of the woman who created a monster. It was in these pages she described her sons as iterations of the will, and detailed her belief that the removal of conscience was the ultimate evolutionary step. She even described a concoction she would administer to them, a blend of obscure herbs and early, unsanctioned chemical compounds intended to suppress what she called the sentimental centers of the brain. The children, growing up within the manor's walls, had no external frame of reference. Alara's reality became their only truth. Their father, Elias, finally fled the house one horrifying evening, unable to bear the weight of his wife's escalating madness. He did not take his sons. He vanished, disappearing into the night, leaving his children to the mercy of their creator. His absence only solidified Alara's power, eliminating the last vestige of conventional morality within the manor. The villagers' whispers intensified, fueled by the abrupt and unexplained vanishing of Elias Thorne. The local constable, a well-meaning but utterly outmatched man named Sergeant Davies, attempted a cursory investigation. He was met at the manor's imposing iron gates by Alara herself. Her demeanor was one of cold, aristocratic disdain, her eyes possessing a chilling flatness that unnerved the officer. She informed him with clinical precision that her husband had suffered a sudden mental breakdown and had departed for a private sanatorium abroad, citing his eccentric preoccupation with minor matters. Davies, intimidated by her wealth, her intellect, and the sheer chilling atmosphere surrounding the place, dropped the inquiry. This brief interaction perfectly illustrates Alara's genius. She didn't hide. She simply manufactured a more palatable truth and enforced it with her sheer force of will. In the absence of a father figure, the emotional void was filled by Alara's increasingly forbidden curriculum. She focused their academic studies entirely on Machiavelli, military strategy, and obscure texts on dominance and control. Playtime was replaced by strategic games that invariably ended in one brother achieving total, humiliating victory over the other. This was not sibling rivalry. It was a controlled psychological battlefield. The macabre tension between William and Arthur became a palpable, heavy thing within the manor. William, the elder, naturally gravitated toward the role of the dominant aggressor, mimicking his mother's cold authority. Arthur, more sensitive by nature despite the conditioning, developed a cunning, manipulative streak, a passive-aggressive defense mechanism against William's overt cruelty. Alara observed this with a terrifying satisfaction, noting that the purge was yielding two distinct, yet equally potent, psychological profiles. She had moved beyond simple obedience. She was cultivating rivalry, the ultimate catalyst for the kind of destructive power she craved. It was around this time that the first small, almost imperceptible signs of defiance began to appear in Arthur. A fleeting look of hatred, quickly masked. A quiet refusal to follow an arbitrary order. These were not acts of rebellion, but sparks of a terrifying, repressed self, hinting at the true monster waiting to be unleashed. The creeping dread around the Thorn Manor was not entirely without foundation in fact, even beyond the psychological horror unfolding within. Alara Thorne's twisted practices extended to the very earth around her property. She had a manic obsession with controlling her environment, believing that purity of surroundings was essential for the creation of her perfect minds. This manifested in bizarre, unsettling ways. She banned local wildlife from the grounds, employing groundskeepers not to maintain the gardens, but to systematically remove and destroy any animals, birds, rabbits, even insects, that dared to cross the boundary. Her stated reason was the taint of the wild, but the effect was a landscape of unnatural, almost sterile silence, a profound quietude that only amplified the pervasive sense of macabre isolation. The groundskeepers, handsomely paid and fiercely loyal due to the isolation of their work and their need for income, carried out these horrifying directives in secret, knowing the local reaction should the truth be known. This sterile environment mirrored the emotional landscape Alara had manufactured for her sons, a world purged of the messy, unpredictable vitality of life. It was a suffocating, controlled microcosm. The boys, now teenagers, were deeply immersed in Alara's forbidden library. They devoured texts on ancient toxicology, advanced mathematics, and, most disturbingly, psychological warfare. Alara made them apply these lessons to their own relationship. She instituted what she called the weekly trial, a forced intellectual competition where the stakes were terrifyingly real. The loser would be subjected to a form of punishment designed not to inflict physical pain, but profound humiliation and emotional isolation, a technique far more effective for destroying their spirit. On one occasion, Arthur lost a chess match. His punishment was to be locked in the manor's bell tower for 3 days, allowed only stale bread and water, his only company the mournful clang of the bell every hour, a sound that seemed to mock his failure. William, who had won, was required to stand guard, forbidden from showing any sympathy. This cruel exercise was not merely a punishment, it was a lesson in supremacy and the complete suppression of fraternal bond. It was during these trials that the true creepy extent of their conditioning became clear. They no longer saw each other as brothers, but as rivals in a deadly game controlled by the only person they genuinely feared, their mother. As the brothers entered their early adulthood, the lines between Alara's twisted practices and outright criminality began to blur. The chemical compounds mentioned in her journal, intended to suppress sentimental centers, were administered more frequently and in higher doses. These were not placebos. They were experimental psychotropics and plant extracts with documented, yet banned, neurotoxic effects. They induced a terrifying emotional detachment, bordering on clinical psychopathy, but also caused erratic behavior, terrifying mood swings, and a deep, simmering paranoia in both William and Arthur. The goal was to create focused ruthlessness, but the side effect was the forging of two increasingly unstable, dangerous men. The manor became a place of sudden, unpredictable violence, not against their mother, who remained the untouchable center of their universe, but against each other, or against the few servants remaining. One maid, a woman named Agnes who had worked in the house for decades, vanished without a trace one autumn evening. The official story, again provided by Alara with chilling composure, was that Agnes had retired suddenly due to ill health. But the macabre truth that Sergeant Davies would file away years later as an unresolved cold case, was far darker. Agnes had witnessed one of William's unpredictable outbursts, a moment where the chemical suppression failed, and a brief, terrifying glimpse of the monster Alara had created was exposed. She saw William inflict casual, almost bored cruelty on a stable hand. Agnes was swiftly and silently dealt with, her fate serving as a silent, horrifying lesson to the few remaining staff. See nothing, hear nothing, say nothing. Alara, upon discovering Agnes's demise, did not chastise William for the act itself. Her critique was purely tactical. She reprimanded him for his sloppiness, for leaving an unmanageable loose end. This chilling response confirmed to William that the rules of the world, as dictated by his mother, did not include conventional morality. The only sin was inefficiency. Arthur, observing all this from the shadows, learned an equally disturbing lesson. If an act must be committed, it must be untraceable. The pressure cooker environment that Alara had meticulously crafted was designed to push her sons to their psychological breaking point, a point she believed was necessary for the ultimate refinement of their character. She began to introduce a new, forbidden element into their conditioning, the concept of the single, necessary sacrifice. She framed it as the ultimate test of their detachment, the definitive proof that they had purged the softness of ordinary humanity. The language she used was veiled, philosophical, but the underlying intent was horrifyingly clear. She was conditioning them for murder. She would leave cryptic notes for them, philosophical riddles that always pointed back to the same macabre conclusion. Only one true thorn could exist. The rivalry between William and Arthur, already a poisonous, volatile thing, now acquired a terrifying, existential dimension. They knew instinctively that their mother was escalating the stakes, that the trials were no longer about winning an argument or a chess game, but about survival. The tension in the manor became a living, breathing entity, thick, suffocating, and charged with anticipation. The boys, brilliant, conditioned, and chemically unstable, began to see shadows in every corner, to hear accusations in every creak of the old house. Paranoia was not a side effect. It was the intended result. Alara wanted them hypervigilant, perpetually on edge, ready to strike. It was a creepy form of parental control that weaponized their own fear. This period saw the last faint flicker of the brothers' shared humanity vanish. A final, shared memory from their early childhood, a brief moment of genuine, unspoken camaraderie while observing the stars from the observatory, was systematically destroyed by Alara. She forced them to debate the purely scientific, cold mechanics of stellar decay, mocking any suggestion of beauty or wonder. By turning every human experience into a clinical, disturbing lesson in detachment, she sealed their fate. She had created not one monster, but two, and she was preparing them for the ultimate confrontation, a cold case waiting to happen. The climax of Alara's twisted practices centered around a final, forbidden competition she orchestrated under the guise of an academic exercise. She presented her sons with a complex ethical problem, a scenario she had meticulously designed to test the ultimate limits of their conditioning. The scenario involved the distribution of a limited, life-saving resource, a classic philosophical trolley problem, but with a macabre twist. The final decision had to be executed, not just debated. The resource was a sealed glass vial containing an unknown but clearly volatile substance. The recipients were two carefully chosen, distant relatives, one, an aging, benevolent uncle, the other, a young, promising cousin. The riddle, presented with the gravitas of a legal document, posed the question: who lives and who dies according to the doctrine of the purge of the softness? The chilling truth, which Alara had concealed, was that both scenarios led to the same horrifying outcome. The contents of the vial were a fast-acting poison, and the entire exercise was designed simply to force one brother to actively choose the death of another human being. The psychological weight of this test was immense, even for their heavily conditioned minds. For days, the manor was utterly silent, save for the furious scribbling of pens as William and Arthur debated the problem on paper, each trying to outmaneuver the other with cold, ruthless logic that they believed would please their mother. Arthur, in a moment of desperate, creepy inspiration, realized that the correct answer, the one that truly adhered to Alara's philosophy, was not who deserved to live, but who posed the greater threat to the other. He began to see that the competition had only ever been between them. The scenario, the vial, the relatives, all mere props. The true target was always the rival. The realization hit him with the force of a curse, and in that moment the cunning, manipulative aspect of his psyche took over. He understood the final, disturbing game their mother was playing. Arthur's moment of clarity was a terrifying epiphany. He understood that to survive Alara's final test, he could not simply win the academic debate. He had to eliminate the opponent in the game's ultimate forbidden move. His brother, William, remained blinded by the intellectual facade of the problem, still attempting to apply a detached, utilitarian logic to the scenario. William's arrogance, cultivated meticulously by Alara, was his fatal flaw. He believed he was the chosen one, the perfected specimen. Arthur, the quieter, more observant son, recognized the truth. Perfection, to Alara, meant ultimate, unquestioning subservience, and the only way to prove that was by committing the ultimate, macabre act. The air between the brothers thickened with unspoken intent. The philosophical treatise on paper had become a contract written in foreshadowed blood. Arthur began to observe William with a new, terrifying focus, looking for weakness, looking for opportunity. The manor's isolation, once merely a backdrop, now became a claustrophobic cage. The constant low hum of paranoia, fueled by the chemical cocktails Alara still administered, was reaching a fever pitch. One evening, Alara summoned them both. She declared that the time for debate was over. She presented them with the vial, the supposed life-saving resource, and two unmarked glasses. The winner of the debate, she announced, had earned the right to administer the solution. She then revealed the outcome of her judging. William's essay, for its sheer, cold intellectual cruelty, had won. William's face lit up with a horrifying sense of vindication. Arthur, however, felt only the cold grip of inevitability. He knew his brother, in his victory, was already planning the ritual humiliation that would follow. But Arthur had prepared. He had learned one lesson better than William. The monster you create can always be turned against its creator's favorite. If you want to hear more forbidden histories like this, subscribe now, because what follows is even darker, and the final revelation will explain how a mother could watch her own son vanish. The terrifying irony of the situation was that William, the proclaimed victor of the debate and the mother's clear favorite, was about to become the victim of his own unwavering belief in Alara's twisted practices. He saw Arthur's quiet deference as acceptance of defeat, a familiar sign of his younger brother's subservience. He failed to see the subtle, almost imperceptible shift in Arthur's eyes, the quiet, creepy realization of what must be done. As William reached for the vial with a self-satisfied, disturbing smirk, Arthur spoke, his voice unnervingly calm, cutting through the tense silence of the study. "Mother," he said, using the formal address he had been conditioned to employ, "William's treatise was excellent, but it contained a flaw, a residue of sentimentality I believe you missed." Alara, intrigued by the unexpected challenge, motioned for him to elaborate. Arthur then proceeded to dissect William's logic with surgical precision, pointing out one key philosophical deviation from the purge of the softness. The deviation, Arthur argued, was that William had accounted for the preservation of his own genetic line, a move Arthur claimed was driven by base, self-serving emotion, the very softness they were banned from possessing. Alara listened, her face a mask of intense concentration. She saw the brilliance of Arthur's accusation. It was a perfect internal betrayal, using her own forbidden philosophy as the weapon. William protested, his composure finally cracking, his carefully constructed emotional detachment dissolving into rage. He lunged for the vial, but Alara's hand shot out, intercepting him with a strength that belied her age. Her eyes, fixed on Arthur, held a chilling, new respect. "Continue, Arthur," she commanded. It was in that moment that Arthur delivered the final, macabre blow. The true perfection, he argued, was to eliminate the unpredictable variable. And the most unpredictable variable in the room was the victor, the one driven by the very ego Alara sought to eradicate. Alara Thorne's expression, as Arthur delivered his horrifying summation, was one of pure intellectual ecstasy. She was witnessing the ultimate culmination of her life's work, not the simple obedience of William, but the calculated, ruthless betrayal of Arthur. He had mastered the lesson not just of detachment, but of supreme, amoral opportunism. She smiled, a wide, disturbing expression that never reached her cold eyes. "William," she stated, her voice devoid of emotion, Your brother is correct. The ego of victory is a weakness. The goal is the elimination of weakness itself. William, standing by the table, felt the foundation of his entire existence crumble. Everything he had been taught, every act of cruelty he had performed, had been for this moment of validation, and now it was being stripped away. His rage turned instantly to a primal, blinding fear. He knew what Arthur's victory meant. He knew the curse of the thorn doctrine. He lunged, not at Arthur, but at the vial, attempting to destroy the proof, the variable, the instrument of his downfall. But Arthur was faster. He had anticipated the desperate move. He grabbed the glass Alara had set aside for the solution, and in a swift, practiced motion, a motion rehearsed hundreds of times in the manor's solitary confinement, he delivered a sharp, incapacitating blow to William's temple. William crumpled instantly, the sound the sickening thud that echoed in the opening scene of this macabre history. The manor was silent again. Alara Thorne did not flinch. She observed the scene with the clinical detachment of a scientist documenting the final stage of an experiment. Arthur stood over his brother, the glass clutched in his hand, his breathing heavy, yet controlled. The elder son, the favored one, was now nothing more than a failed prototype, a monster destroyed by the true, perfected monster his mother had created. The cold case was born in that moment, in the cold, hard certainty of a mother's gaze. The aftermath of the violent confrontation was handled with the same creepy efficiency that characterized all of Alara Thorne's twisted practices. There was no panic, no remorse, only a cold, methodical cleanup operation. Arthur, now completely under the spell of his own lethal success, followed his mother's instructions without question. William's body was not to be simply disposed of. His vanishing had to be executed with the macabre perfection that Alara demanded. She tasked Arthur with an assignment that served a dual purpose, eliminating the evidence and completing his final conditioning. William's body was to be dissolved in a bath of corrosive chemicals, an advanced and forbidden technique Alara had learned from her father's esoteric texts on early embalming and decomposition acceleration. The entire procedure took place in a forgotten subcellar of the manor, a place designed for just such an emergency. Arthur worked for hours, his hands stained by the horrifying task, his mind simultaneously horrified and numbly detached. He was no longer a son. He was an agent, an instrument of his mother's perfect, destructive will. Alara did not assist. She simply stood at the top of the cellar stairs, watching, timing the procedure, and taking detailed notes in her leather-bound journal. She was documenting the birth of the final monster. When the work was complete and nothing remained but a viscous, unidentifiable residue, she nodded, a silent acknowledgement of his success. The official story, swiftly deployed, was that William Thorne, distraught over the academic competition, had vanished from the manor and the entire region. Alara made a show of minimal, controlled grief, giving a perfunctory statement to Sergeant Davies that her son had left a vague, despairing note. Davies, now completely out of his depth and intimidated by the Thorne name, once again filed the case as an unresolved cold case, a note of mysterious disappearance in the unforgiving Yorkshire moorlands. With William vanished and Arthur firmly installed as the triumphant, perfected monster, the dynamic within the Thorne manor shifted, but the disturbing intensity remained. Alara did not relax her control, she refined it. Arthur was now her singular focus, the ultimate expression of her twisted practices. He was showered with the intellectual rewards of his victory, access to even more forbidden knowledge, and the acknowledgement that he was finally worthy of the Thorne lineage. But beneath the facade of reward, a new, creepy form of psychological control was being implemented. Alara began to subtly, but consistently, remind Arthur of the price of his supremacy. She would refer to William's weakness, and then casually mention that all monsters, even perfected ones, must guard against the return of the softness. The unspoken threat was a constant, low-frequency hum of dread. He had eliminated his brother, and he knew, with chilling certainty, that his mother was fully capable of eliminating him if he failed to maintain her impossible standard of ruthlessness. Arthur was free, but he was free only within the confines of his mother's complete control. He was now the only subject of the experiment. This intense, isolated period marked Arthur's descent into true, unadulterated psychopathy. The chemical interventions continued, maintaining his emotional flatness while enhancing his intellectual acuity. He pursued academic studies with a cold, terrifying focus, achieving remarkable success in obscure fields of mathematics and theoretical physics. He became a man whose intellect was vast and shining, but whose soul was a black, empty void. He was the perfect weapon. Alara had succeeded in creating her curse, her self-sustaining instrument of amoral will. The local whispers continued, now centered on the single, reclusive young man who lived in the silent, macabre manor with his chilling mother. They said he carried the banned look of a person who had seen the horrifying face of God and walked away entirely unchanged. The isolation of the manor, the lack of external scrutiny, and the suppression of the two cold case vanishings, Elias and William, created a feedback loop of increasingly macabre behavior between mother and son. Arthur's education shifted from theoretical ruthlessness to practical application. Alara began testing his capacity for emotional control in real-world scenarios. She would orchestrate small, cruel acts of manipulation against local figures, a bank manager, a solicitor, a minor official, all designed to give Arthur practice in what she called leveraging human predictability. These weren't crimes of passion, but cold, calculated exercises in control, often resulting in the targeted individuals suffering financial ruin or public humiliation. Arthur executed these tasks with clinical detachment, proving his mastery of Alara's twisted practices. He enjoyed the feeling of invisible power, the ability to destroy a life with a single, untraceable action. But as Arthur's power grew, so too did a subtle, creepy seed of resentment toward his mother. He was the perfected monster, yet he remained on a leash. He was the instrument of her will, not the master of his own. This conflict, the creation challenging the creator, began to manifest in small, almost imperceptible acts of defiance. He would deliberately misplace one of her journals, or subtly change the chemical composition of the sedative she took to aid her insomnia. These acts were not designed to harm her immediately, but to establish a tiny, private territory of control that was forbidden to her. Alara, the ultimate manipulator, was oblivious to these minor rebellions. She saw only the success of her creation, blinded by her own arrogance. She believed her psychological control was absolute. It was a fatal miscalculation. The architect of a monster never truly controls the final, autonomous will of its creation. The eventual, horrifying confrontation was not a matter of if, but when the perfect weapon would be turned back on the hand that forged it. The turning point in this disturbing narrative came during one of Alara's elaborate intellectual discussions with Arthur. She was detailing a new phase of her purge philosophy, one that involved a much wider application of their principles, an expansion of their twisted practices beyond the manor and into the world. Her plan was ambitious, terrifying, and deeply rooted in the need for external validation. She revealed her long-term goal: to use Arthur's intellect and their accumulated forbidden knowledge to gain control over influential institutions, subtly altering societal norms to align with her vision of ruthless, macabre efficiency. Arthur listened, outwardly compliant, but inwardly a torrent of cold calculation. He realized that this external venture would expose them both to scrutiny, to variables that Alara could not control. More importantly, it would place her in a position of global authority, solidifying her control over him for the rest of his life. The perfected monster saw an immediate catastrophic threat to his own hard-won, terrifying autonomy. The moment Alara uttered the word legacy, Arthur knew he had to act. Her pursuit of a wider curse was his undoing. He feigned enthusiasm, agreeing enthusiastically with her grand vision, even suggesting minor, technical improvements to her plan. This performance of subservience lulled Alara into a false sense of security. She began to treat him less like a son and more like a trusted, albeit brilliant, lieutenant. This was the opening Arthur needed. He began to apply the lessons he had learned from her own horrifying curriculum, the creation of a perfect, cold case. He started a meticulous process of poisoning, not with the quick-acting compounds he had witnessed destroy his brother, but with a slow, undetectable neurotoxin, a substance derived from an obscure tropical plant that he had discovered in his father's banned botanical library. The process was drawn out, weeks of subtle deterioration carefully masked by Alara's own increasing arrogance and her genuine, blinding belief in his loyalty. Arthur's method of poisoning his mother was a chilling testament to his complete mastery of her twisted practices. It was slow, subtle, and utterly untraceable by the medical science of the time. The neurotoxin worked not by causing sudden distress, but by subtly mimicking the onset of natural senescence, a gradual decline in motor control, cognitive function, and memory. The irony was macabre. Alara, who had obsessed over perfection and control, was slowly watching her own mental acuity, her most prized possession, erode. She dismissed the early symptoms as mere fatigue from her ambitious planning. Arthur, the devoted son, was always there to administer her tonics, her nightly tea, the very agents of her slow destruction. He observed her decline with the same clinical, detached interest she had shown during William's demise. He documented her symptoms in her own journal, a final, disturbing act of psychological dominance. One evening, Alara forgot the key tenet of her own philosophy, a concept she had drilled into them since childhood. Arthur, watching her struggle, felt a profound, creepy satisfaction. He had not merely killed her. He had dismantled her mind, proving that his intelligence, his ruthlessness, had surpassed hers in the final, most important test: survival. When Alara finally collapsed, not dramatically but quietly slipping away in her sleep one cold morning, the official cause of death was attributed to natural causes, hastened by overwork and stress. The family physician, intimidated by the Thorn name and already slightly suspicious of the isolated manor, asked no difficult questions. This was no cold case. It was a perfect, internal assassination, executed by the ultimate monster she had created. Arthur had not only freed himself, he had perfectly applied the forbidden lessons of his horrifying upbringing. His mother's legacy was not the continuation of her work, but her own untraceable death at the hands of her masterpiece. With the death of Alara Thorne, Arthur inherited everything: the manor, the fortune, the vast, forbidden library, and the terrifying, empty landscape of his own soul. The perfected monster was finally free, but his freedom was a curse. He was a man with unparalleled intellect, devoid of any internal moral compass, anchored only by the destructive, twisted practices of his upbringing. The years immediately following Alara's death saw Arthur retreat even further into the manor's isolating walls. He became a reclusive figure, the subject of even more intense local gossip. The villagers whispered of a hereditary madness, of the banned energies surrounding the house. They said he was driven insane by the vanishings and the sudden death of his mother. They were wrong. He was not mad. He was meticulously, clinically detached. Arthur began to apply his intellect to areas that Alara had only considered theoretical. He began to delve into the very nature of control, using his wealth to fund obscure research into psychological conditioning and neurochemistry, moving his mother's former laboratory into the 20th century. His experiments were conducted in absolute secrecy, attracting only the most desperate or amoral scientific minds. The objective was the ultimate refinement of Alara's purge, not just the elimination of conscience in a single subject, but the potential for mass psychological control. This was Arthur's way of both honoring and surpassing his mother's macabre legacy. The unresolved cold case of his brother and father, the unsettling silence of the manor, and the creepy regularity of Arthur's nocturnal laboratory work became the new normal for the isolated community. He was a force of nature, brilliant, invisible, and terrifyingly active. The woman who created the monster was gone, but the monster she created was now unbound, and its gaze was fixed outward, toward the rest of the unsuspecting world. Arthur Thorne's terrifying experiments and his solitary, powerful existence in the manor were only possible due to the extensive documentation his mother had kept. Alara's leather-bound journal, the very record of her twisted practices and the horrifying destruction of her sons, became Arthur's foundational text, the forbidden blueprint for his own work. He studied her notes on William and Arthur with a detached, professional air, analyzing their failures and successes. He saw William's rage and predictable defeat as a failure of controlled isolation, while recognizing his own cold opportunism as the desired, yet volatile, outcome. Arthur sought to reproduce the outcome without the volatility. His research focused on the chemical compounds Alara had administered, the concoctions designed to suppress sentimental centers. He refined these formulas, aiming for a stable, long-term state of functional psychopathy. He wasn't interested in simple mind control. He wanted to create an army of perfectly rational, ruthlessly ambitious individuals, miniature monsters, self-aware and supremely effective, who would execute his will without understanding the grand, macabre design. The manor's extensive grounds became a testing facility. Unlike his mother, Arthur did not use his family or servants. His early test subjects were animals, but soon they became less savory elements of society, drifters, petty criminals, and others whose vanishing would go unnoticed. These were the true cold case files Arthur amassed in the shadows, their fates documented with the same meticulous, creepy detail Alara had used to log her son's development. The local police, years after Sergeant Davies' retirement, continued to dismiss the growing number of local vanishings as simply the consequence of the nearby industrial center's transient population. Arthur Thorne remained above suspicion, an untouchable, wealthy eccentric, shielded by the legacy of his mother's perfect isolation. The nature of Arthur's work was intrinsically linked to the geographical isolation of the manor, but the true brilliance of his control lay in his forbidden ability to manipulate the surrounding community. He maintained the perception of the manor as a place under a curse, actively encouraging the local folklore of ghosts and macabre occurrences. He would subtly orchestrate strange lights in the tower windows or brief, creepy mechanical sounds on the moor, ensuring the villagers maintained their distance. Fear was his first line of defense, a strategy he learned from his mother's successful handling of the cold case vanishings. Arthur's next layer of defense was control through indebtedness. He used his vast wealth to quietly buy up mortgages and small businesses in the surrounding villages. He became the invisible benefactor, the silent landlord, and the source of employment for many. This strategy guaranteed a deep, self-imposed silence among the locals. They were afraid to talk about the strange events at the manor, not just out of superstition, but out of a very real fear of financial ruin. The monster understood that control through economic dependency was far more stable than control through simple physical force. This allowed him to conduct his increasingly disturbing experiments with impunity, knowing that no alarm would ever be raised, no true investigation initiated. The twisted practices of the Thorne family had evolved from a psychological experiment on two children to a sophisticated small-scale form of societal control. Arthur Thorne, the monster created by his mother's single-minded ambition, was now actively proving the viability of her philosophy on a wider scale. He was the product of her horrifying work, and now the teacher had been surpassed by the student, whose ambition was even colder and whose scope was far more expansive. Arthur Thorne's ambition began to outpace the confines of his moorland laboratory. He started to realize that true, lasting power required not just secret control, but public influence. He recognized that the intellectual conditioning he received from Alara had prepared him for dominance in the world of high finance and political strategy. He began a quiet, methodical infiltration of London's elite circles. He would attend meetings not to speak, but to observe, to identify the soft, emotional weaknesses in powerful men, the very softness his mother had banned from his own psyche. He used the Thorne wealth and his profound clinical intellect to maneuver through complex financial markets, always operating in the shadows, always ensuring his victories were untraceable back to any personal ambition. He was the ghost in the machine, and his goal was the acquisition of control over capital and information. This phase of his life was a chilling demonstration of Ilara's ultimate success. Arthur was capable of functioning in society, of projecting an aura of eccentric genius, while remaining completely devoid of human empathy or morality. He was the perfect, high-functioning sociopath, the ideal monster. Yet beneath the veneer of success, the curse of his past remained. He was perpetually on guard, forever haunted by the possibility of a superior intellect, a better-conditioned rival who might have learned Ilara's forbidden lessons better than he had. The destruction of his brother, William, had been a lesson in paranoia as much as it was in ruthlessness. Arthur never truly trusted his own freedom, knowing it had been purchased with an act of macabre violence. This internal pressure, the fear of being discovered, the fear of a rival, the fear of his own conditioning failing, kept him in a constant state of hypervigilance, fueling his need for ever-increasing control. The creepy truth was that Ilara's practices had created a monster that could never find peace. Arthur's growing public presence, however subtle, eventually drew the attention of a man who would become his greatest, albeit unintended, rival, Detective Inspector Alastair Finch. Finch was not focused on the cold case of the Thorne family's vanishings. He was a specialist in financial fraud and political corruption. His initial interest in Arthur was purely professional, stemming from a pattern of highly unusual, perfectly executed financial maneuvers that seemed to benefit a shadowy, untraceable entity. Finch saw not a monster, but a genius manipulating the system. But as he began to dig deeper, the macabre threads of Arthur's past began to surface. Finch was unnerved by the stories of the manor, the whispers of the band experiments, the persistent local rumors of the horrifying silence surrounding the Thorne family history. He commissioned a discreet, unauthorized historical survey of the Thorne records, unearthing the long-forgot, dismissive reports filed by Sergeant Davies regarding Elias and William. The two unresolved cold cases, once separate and easily ignored, began to form a disturbing pattern in Finch's mind. He started to suspect that the man who manipulated the stock market with such cold, clinical precision might be capable of a far darker, more personal form of crime. The psychological profile Finch began to build of Arthur was creepy, a man incapable of fear or empathy, yet driven by an obsessive need for control. Finch's investigation became a private obsession, a duel of intellects across the vast, anonymous landscape of London finance. He was trying to catch a ghost, a monster whose existence was predicated on his mother's twisted practices and the utter absence of a moral paper trail. The detective knew he couldn't touch Arthur through the law. He had to find a different kind of leverage, a secret from the manor that Arthur himself could not control. He was searching for the physical proof of the curse. Detective Inspector Finch, recognizing that conventional policing was useless against Arthur's intellectual fortress, began an unorthodox, forbidden investigation into the Thorne Manor itself. He immersed himself in the local folklore, talking to the oldest, most superstitious residents, the ones whose silence Arthur's financial control could not entirely buy. He learned about the strange, acrid smells, the unusual activities of the groundskeepers, and the pervasive, macabre sense of dread that hung over the property. These whispers were the faint, residual echoes of Ilara's twisted practices. Finch focused on the manor's architecture, finding obscure blueprints and construction records. He was looking for any anomaly, any space unaccounted for. His search finally led him to an old, brittle ledger in a municipal archive, a record of unusual industrial-strength chemical purchases made by Elias Thorne decades earlier, purchases that were entirely out of place for a private residence. Finch connected this to the rumors of William's vanishing and the horrifying possibility of chemical disposal. He began to suspect a hidden area, a laboratory or a subcellar designed for the creepy and the covert. This led him, years after the fact, back to Sergeant Davies' cold case files. Tucked away in the appendix of William's missing person report was a small, hand-drawn map of the manor's foundation, sketched by a long-gone construction worker who had been troubled by a request to wall off a specific deep basement area. The map, barely legible, pointed to the location of the subcellar where Arthur had dissolved his brother's body. Finch knew he was finally on the trail of physical evidence, the final, undeniable proof that the monster was real. The pursuit had moved from the abstract world of finance to the concrete, disturbing reality of the Thorne family's unspeakable violence. If you have been captivated by this journey into forbidden history, take a moment to subscribe and ensure you don't miss the chilling climax of this macabre story. Finch's discovery of the hidden subcellar was the key, but gaining access to the heavily fortified Thorne Manor remained the central challenge. Arthur Thorne, the monster of Alara's design, was a fortress builder, both physically and psychologically. Finch knew a frontal assault would fail, allowing Arthur to activate his perfect evasion protocols learned from his mother's meticulous training in disappearing from legal scrutiny. The detective shifted his focus to the one aspect of Arthur's life that remained exposed, his obsessive, almost ritualistic, rereading of his mother's journals. Finch theorized that this was the curse of his perfection, the inescapable need for validation from his deceased creator. He believed that the journals were Arthur's anchor, and their security was his blind spot. Finch found a former groundskeeper, an elderly man whose silence was finally broken by guilt and the promise of protection. This man revealed a small, seldom used service tunnel beneath the library, a secret access point known only to the original builders and Alara herself. It was the only way in without triggering the manor's complex, custom-built security systems. Under the cover of a fierce storm, the same kind of macabre weather that had witnessed William's demise, Finch and a small, trusted team executed their forbidden entry. They found the manor in a state of unnerving, creepy silence, a monument to the twisted practices of the past. The atmosphere was thick with a palpable sense of dread, the lingering residue of decades of psychological and physical violence. Their target was the subcellar, but Finch was most interested in the library, the repository of the horrifying knowledge and the journals that detailed the creation of the monster. The scene inside the Thorne Manor's library was the disturbing centerpiece of the entire macabre history. It was a cathedral of forbidden knowledge, lined floor-to-ceiling with rare, brittle, leather-bound books, the original source material for Alara's twisted practices. At the center of the room, on a heavy oak desk, sat the object of Finch's quest, Alara Thorne's personal journal, its pages filled with her meticulous, emotionless script detailing the psychological deconstruction and eventual destruction of her sons. The sight was horrifying, a medical log detailing the creation of a monster. Finch did not even need to read far to find the most chilling evidence. The entry dated the night of William's vanishing was a triumph of clinical detail, describing William's final moments, Arthur's cold efficiency, and the subsequent chemical disposal. It was the unassailable proof of murder, written by the co-conspirator and the victim's own mother. However, the journal contained a final, creepy postscript, written in a different hand, Arthur's own. It was a triumphant, analytical entry detailing Alara's slow poisoning, a final, cold note on the ultimate effectiveness of his own forbidden skills. It was the monster signing his masterpiece. Finch knew that this journal was more than evidence. It was the entire curse made manifest. As his team descended to the subcellar, following the original construction map, Finch waited, the leather-bound book clutched in his gloved hands. He knew the evidence would be minimal, the physical residue of a chemical cleanup decades in the past, but the combination of the journal and the subcellar's purpose would be undeniable. The cold case was minutes away from being tragically, disturbingly solved. The subcellar, once the scene of Arthur's final, horrifying act of fraternal violence and chemical disposal, was cold and dank, the air heavy with the lingering, almost metallic scent of decay and old chemicals. The team found what Finch expected: a stone basin built into the floor, subtly reinforced against corrosive agents, and a complex, sealed drainage system leading deep underground. Though decades had passed, and the physical evidence was minimal, a forensic sweep of the stone basin yielded microscopic traces of bone and specific, rare chemical compounds that matched the purchases Finch had documented earlier, the agents used for accelerated decomposition. It was the definitive, macabre proof of William's final vanishing. The combined evidence, Alara's journal, Arthur's postscript, and the chemical residue in the subcellar, was enough to secure an immediate warrant for Arthur Thorne's arrest. But Arthur was gone. He had vanished as perfectly and meticulously as his mother had trained him. His departure was not a panic-driven flight, but a calculated clinical evacuation. Finch arrived at the library to find the oak desk empty, the journal replaced by a single, carefully folded note. The note was not an admission of guilt, but a final, creepy message from the monster to the detective. It read, "The true measure of control is not the ability to govern, but the ability to vanish completely. Mother taught me well." Arthur had clearly anticipated the eventual discovery of the manor's secrets. He had built his entire external life on the premise of its collapse, and when the pressure became too great, he activated his final, forbidden protocol: absolute disappearance. The cold case of the Thorne family had its central figure, but no resolution. Arthur Thorne's vanishing became the ultimate, final act of his mother's twisted practices. Alara had trained her sons not just to destroy, but to survive scrutiny, a lesson Arthur had mastered beyond her wildest, most macabre ambitions. Finch's investigation, despite its success in unearthing the disturbing truth of the Thorne family, hit a permanent wall. Arthur's financial and identity paper trail was a masterpiece of misdirection, a complex web of shell corporations and untraceable assets that made following him impossible. He had, years prior, established multiple, fully formed alternate identities, each with clean histories, separate banking, and no connection to the manor or his birth name. He was a ghost with a multi-million-pound safety net. This was the ultimate victory of Alara's curse. The monster was now banned from the world, but free within its vast, self-created anonymity. The manor itself, its horrifying secrets now exposed to the world, was seized by the authorities. The library, the laboratory, and the subcellar were meticulously documented, becoming a grim, academic archive of extreme psychological abuse and forbidden scientific experimentation. Alara's journals, the chilling record of her creepy design, became central to the study of functional psychopathy, a terrifying, real-world case study of a woman who deliberately set out to destroy the humanity of her children. Yet, the story of Arthur Thorne remained open, a chilling ellipsis on a tale of generational violence. The final monster was still out there, unpunished, living his life of perfect, amoral freedom, a walking testament to the destructive power of his mother's will. The public reaction to the revelations from the Thorne Manor was one of horrifying disbelief and profound macabre fascination. The story became a sensation, a modern Gothic tragedy rooted in the disturbing reality of human cruelty. The details of Alara's twisted practices, the sensory deprivation, the chemical conditioning, the forced fratricide, were so extreme they seemed forbidden, almost fictional. The media frenzy forced the authorities to formally reopen the cold case of William Thorne and Elias Thorne, though the outcome was predetermined. The cases were declared solved in terms of the crime and the perpetrator, but the perpetrator, Arthur, remained an uncatchable monster. The manor house, once a symbol of eccentric reclusiveness, became a morbid tourist attraction, until the government eventually ordered its demolition, citing its association with banned and dangerous psychological experiments. The physical embodiment of the curse was to be erased from the landscape. However, the demolition could not erase the legacy. Detective Inspector Finch, now a reluctant public figure, dedicated the rest of his career to tracking Arthur Thorne, viewing the pursuit not as a professional duty, but as a personal moral imperative. He was the only one who truly understood the nature of the creepy perfection Arthur represented. Finch never succeeded in locating him, but his meticulous investigation created the only detailed profile of the monster, a man who looked ordinary, operated with clinical brilliance, and was fundamentally incapable of human connection. The final, disturbing thought that haunted Finch was the possibility that Arthur had not simply vanished to live a quiet, anonymous life. Ilara's training dictated dominance, and Finch feared that the perfected monster was now operating somewhere in the world, subtly applying his mother's forbidden principles to a much, much larger canvas. The focus then shifted to the potential whereabouts and continued activities of Arthur Thorne. Detective Finch hypothesized that Arthur would be drawn to an environment that valued his specific, conditioned skill set, ruthlessness, detachment, and an ability to manipulate complex, abstract systems. This led Finch to investigate connections in the burgeoning fields of international espionage and global finance, the exact areas Ilara had intended him to dominate. He found fleeting, disturbing hints, a vanished investment portfolio here, a sudden, inexplicable political shift there, that seemed to bear the hallmark of Arthur's clinical, macabre touch. But every lead was a ghost, every connection a deliberate dead end constructed by the ultimate master of forbidden misdirection. Finch was essentially chasing a perfectly engineered algorithm, a monster that had been programmed to leave no signature. The only tangible evidence of Arthur's continued existence came from a single, creepy encounter years after his disappearance. A former associate of Arthur's, a minor financier who had been ruined by one of Arthur's early, untraceable schemes, claimed to have seen him in a high-security casino in Monte Carlo. The description was unremarkable. A quiet man, middle-aged, impeccably dressed, but with eyes that were flat, utterly empty, and always watching. The man reported that Arthur was not gambling. He was observing the other players, noting their tells, their emotional weaknesses. He was still conducting his mother's experiments, just in a different, more lucrative laboratory. This encounter solidified the horrifying reality for Finch. Arthur Thorne was not in hiding. He was simply unburdened by identity, living his life in the open, untouchable, the ultimate cold case in human form. The twisted practices had truly created an autonomous, unstoppable entity, a curse on the world. The legacy of Ilara Thorne extended beyond the singular monster she created. It became a chilling cautionary tale in psychological circles. Her journals, though banned from public consumption due to the disturbing nature of their contents, were studied intensely by forensic psychologists and criminologists. They represented a perfect, inverse example of child development, a macabre how-to guide for destroying a human being's moral core. The consensus was that Ilara's success lay in the complete, closed-system environment she maintained. The isolation, the chemical interventions, and the consistent application of a single, forbidden ideology meant the children never had a chance to develop a conventional sense of self. They were entirely products of their conditioning. What makes the Thorne case a creepy and unique fixture in dark history is that the crime was not a sudden act of passion or a moment of mental illness. It was a decades-long, meticulous project of calculated cruelty. The woman who created the monster did so with a clear objective and a scientific methodology. The terrifying nature of her work was the realization that human morality could be systematically removed, replaced by a cold, operational ruthlessness. The greatest horrifying insight came from a comparative analysis of the brothers. William, the overt aggressor, was too predictable, too reliant on brute force, a failure of sophistication. Arthur, the quiet, manipulative survivor, represented the true success, a monster that could hide in plain sight, using intellect and untraceability as his primary weapons. The final, disturbing implication of Alara's work was that if she could create such an entity out of two ordinary boys, then the principles she uncovered could potentially be used on a wider, more anonymous scale. The curse was not contained within the manor's walls. Its blueprint was now loose in the world. The narrative arc of the Thorn family is a descent into a macabre spiral of ambition and destruction. It began with Alara's intellectual arrogance, moved through the twisted practices she inflicted upon her sons, and culminated in the horrifying mutual vanishing of her family, first the husband and one son, and then Alara herself, a victim of her own perfected monster. The final stage is Arthur's eternal, creepy freedom. The man who solved the cold case, Detective Finch, often spoke of the tragedy's core, that Alara's obsession with creating perfection utterly obliterated the chance for ordinary happiness or even ordinary villainy. She succeeded only in creating an emotional void. The banned lesson of the Thorn family is a stark reminder of the fragile nature of human connection and the immense power of sustained psychological abuse. The narrative ends not with a capture or a redemption, but with a question mark hanging over the globe. Where is Arthur Thorn? What is he doing? The true curse is the perpetual doubt, the knowledge that a man of unimaginable, amoral intellect, trained in the forbidden art of untraceable destruction, is moving through the world. The destruction of her sons was not merely an outcome, it was the mechanism of her success. She had to destroy their humanity to build her monster. The entire story is a perfect loop of self-fulfilling prophecy. A woman terrified of human weakness who created a machine designed to exploit it, only to be eliminated by her own creation. Arthur's enduring existence is the ultimate, disturbing proof that she was right about the power of cold ruthlessness, but catastrophically wrong about her own place in the hierarchy. The question of Elias Thorne's vanishing, the husband and father, remained the most disturbing and unresolved cold case in the family's history. Unlike William, his demise was not fully documented in Alara's journals. The consensus was that he had fled, unable to cope with his wife's escalating twisted practices. But Finch harbored a macabre suspicion that Alara had been even more ruthlessly efficient than she let on. He believed Elias hadn't simply left. He had been eliminated, perhaps as a final, preemptive lesson for William and Arthur. The journal only contained a single, chilling reference to Elias after his disappearance. The unnecessary variable has been successfully removed from the equation. The environment is now sufficiently controlled. This clinical note suggested a degree of intentionality far beyond a simple flight of fancy. Finch theorized that Alara had made Elias a deliberate, untraceable vanishment, an early proof of concept for the final destruction of her family. If this was true, then Alara Thorne's forbidden psychological experiments began not with her sons, but with her husband, whose only crime was his gentle nature, the very softness she despised. The creepy implication is that William and Arthur's conditioning was built on a lie, not just a philosophical construct, but an actual horrifying foundation of parental murder. This would mean that Alara had orchestrated 3 vanishings in total, making her not just a psychological abuser, but a serial familial executioner, all in the name of creating her perfect banned lineage. Arthur, the perfected monster, grew up in a house built on 3 layers of perfect, cold-blooded absence. This added a final, horrifying dimension to the curse he now carried. In a final, macabre twist years after the manor's demolition, Detective Finch received an anonymous package. It contained no note, only a small, beautifully crafted silver locket engraved with the initials W.T., William Thorne. Inside there was no picture but a tiny, rolled-up piece of parchment. Finch carefully unrolled it. The message was a single, cryptic sentence. The equation requires a solution, not a sentiment. This was a direct echo of the philosophical language Alara Thorne had used during the final, fatal competition between her sons, a forbidden phrase known only to the investigators and the inner circle of the now-demolished manor. The message was clearly from Arthur. It was not a threat or an admission. It was a communication, a final, disturbing flex of his untouchable power. He was signaling to Finch that he was still aware, still watching, and still operating under the twisted practices of his mother's creepy philosophy. The locket, a personal item of his murdered brother, suggested that Arthur had revisited the site, or perhaps even kept a relic of his crime, a horrifying trophy of his victory over sentimentality. Finch understood the full meaning of the message. Arthur was confirming that the ultimate, unpunishable crime was the true solution to Alara's challenge. He had eliminated the rival William and the creator Alara to achieve his own perfect vanishment. The monster had completed the cycle of destruction. The cold case would forever be solved, yet the perpetrator would forever be free. This final, disturbing communication sealed the legacy of the woman who created a monster. Her success was absolute, and her influence continued, even from the grave, through the conscienceless actions of her perfected son. The story of Alara Thorne and her two destroyed sons is more than a historical cold case. It is a creepy meditation on the nature of evil and the terrible power of twisted practices when applied with clinical, unwavering focus. Alara, the woman who created a monster, achieved her goal, but at the cost of everything she claimed to value: her family, her name, and eventually her own life. The macabre genius of her forbidden system was that it was self-executing. She did not need to commit the final, horrifying act. She merely needed to create the environment and the perfect weapon to do it for her. Arthur Thorne, the band's son, is the enduring proof of her terrifying success, a figure who exists outside the bounds of human morality, moving through the world as an untouchable force of cold intellect. He is the ultimate curse on his mother's lineage. The empty manor, the vanished family, the silent moor, all serve as a perpetual, disturbing backdrop to a story that, by its very nature, can never fully conclude. Arthur Thorne remains the ghost that Alara wanted, powerful, undetectable, and eternally free from the softness of the human condition. His existence is the final, terrifying testament to the woman who believed she could destroy the soul to create a superior being, and in doing so, unleashed a force that defied all attempts at justice or comprehension. The tale of the Thorne family offers a final, chilling philosophical observation. Alara Thorne's twisted practices were designed to prove that environment and deliberate conditioning could entirely supersede genetics or inherent morality. Her forbidden belief was that a monster could be manufactured. She succeeded in creating Arthur, a being of profound, terrifying amoral efficiency. But the story also carries a subtle, macabre rebuttal to her arrogance. The moment Arthur turned his conditioning back on his mother, eliminating her in a perfect, cold case of poisoning, he was not acting out of love, hate, or any conventional human emotion. He was acting out of self-preservation and a calculated desire for ultimate autonomy, a natural, survivalistic reaction that suggests even Alara's iron-fisted control could not completely extinguish the primal impulse to survive. The creepy reality is that Arthur's final, lethal act might have been the one moment where he was truly an individual, however terrifyingly defined, and not merely a programmed machine. He was still a monster, but one who had chosen his own destiny, a terrifying victory snatched from the jaws of a decades-long horrifying psychological prison. And this, perhaps, is the greatest curse of the Thorne legacy. The most ruthless act, the one that broke the cycle of control, was also the most fundamentally human act of all, the fight for one's own, unburdened existence. And so, the curtains close on the physical stage of the Thorne Macabre story. The manor long since demolished, the cold case file sealed, the woman who created the monster resting in a quiet, unmarked grave. But the narrative is not truly over. The last surviving son, Arthur Thorne, is still out there, a living embodiment of the most disturbing principles of human control. He is a testament to the fact that some vanishings are not about where a person goes, but about the forbidden thing they become. The banned doctrines of Alara Thorne live on in his cold, calculating mind, and in the untraceable actions he continues to take in the shadows of global affairs. He is the ultimate, creepy consequence of a mother's twisted ambition, a perfect weapon aimed at the heart of human society. And as the wind whispers across the empty, scarred moorland where the Thorn Manor once stood, a profound dread lingers. It is the chilling realization that the monster is not hiding under a bed or locked behind bars. He is simply living, perfectly free, perfectly detached, and perfectly prepared. The ultimate horror of this disturbing history is the knowledge that the world is a stage for a monster that was not born, but meticulously, scientifically, and horrifyingly created.